Hello, everyone. How are you guys today? Happy Thursday. I'm Mariana. If you guys have never been here before, this is Mexico Relocation Guide. And today's topic is about why Mexico is not for everyone and why some people leave and why, you might want to know these things ahead of time before moving and then realizing this after the fact and, having to incur the expenses or just to avoid you that surprise. Before we get started, I'd love to know if this is your very first live stream, if you have never seen a Mexico Relocation Guide live stream before, or let me know if this is not your first time watching a live stream in the comments. So thank you all so much for being here right now. Looks like I had an email earlier today from a customer who was confused about the time it started. And I see somebody right now in the comments saying, okay, 6 p.m. So yeah, I sent an email out earlier saying it's 6 p.m. Central Daylight Time or 5 p.m. Mexico City time or Central Standard Time. So just in case anybody's confused about when I send those emails, what that means, I'm giving people who are watching us in the United States a time that it starts, and then people who are watching us in Mexico, what time it starts. So that hopefully clarifies the confusion for any of you guys. So I see some few first timers. Cool. Thank you so much for being here. If this is your first time watching this live stream, I think this is a good topic for you to get introduced to the channel because this topic was inspired or prompted from a comment and an email that I received recently. The email talked about, how shocking it was for this person when they went on a scouting trip. They didn't expect Aguascalientes to be so heavy on traffic, so for people not to speak English, for a lot of things. They were just really frustrated with Aguascalientes, and they expected it to be a really small town, and a lot of things that just really frustrated them. And then I received a comment or a few comments on some videos recently talking about I would love to know some more cons or negatives of living in, XYZ city that we're doing a city tour on. So, and I want to just preface this by saying that just because I show you some really beautiful footage of Mérida or Playa del Carmen or Cozumel or anywhere in Mexico, Atlisco, Ajijic, wherever we have done videos, doesn't mean that there are zero issues in those cities or towns. Obviously, no place is perfect, right? And I don't want to, accidentally mislead anybody by not talking or focusing an entire video of all the negatives of a single city. I'm talking about, usually in those videos, I'm focusing on what it's like to live there. So I'm showing you neighborhoods, cost of living, the cost of rentals, the cost of utilities, the cost of food, what kind of shopping options you have. So anyway, not to go off too much on to what inspired this video, because at the end of the day, I think this is a good topic to bring up every now and then and just kind of bring reality back onto, what are some of the negatives of living in Mexico. So if this is your first time around here, thank you so much. I hope that, today's live stream gives you a reason to come back and then listen to all the other things we have to say about what are the positives of living in Mexico, or why you might like it, or why other people choose to move to Mexico. Thank you so much. Oh, you've seen so many helpful live streams for Mexico Relocation Guide. I'm glad that some of you guys are finding our live streams interesting. So I think there's enough of you on here already that I think I'm going to get started. So I have a list of topics that I want to cover, just so that I don't get too much off track. If you guys don't mind, and if at the end of this live stream you have found this to be useful, I'd really appreciate it if you give it a like, or if you can think of somebody who might benefit from the information that we share on today's topic or live stream, feel free to share it. And if you personally watching at home have a story or a personal topic or something that relates to this topic that you want to share with us, you can comment it in the comment section, or you can also, if you want to be a guest on a future live stream and share your experience of moving to Mexico, I highly recommend that you send me an email at info@mexicorelocationguide.com. I always love talking to people who actually have done it themselves, right? And because this isn't all about like my experience, my perception, or how I have gone through things. This is about collectively the community that we have, all the stories that they've shared, and then of course the experts that we work with and all their customers, and how we can help each other move to Mexico the right way. So anyway, if you want to share your story, send me an email, info@Mexico Relocation Guide. Yeah, one person's negative is another person's positive. I totally agree with that. There are going to be things on this list, obviously. I do want to say that also, that for you might not be a deal breaker, but for some people it might be. So let's get started. The first one is, building regulations. And I do want to say that I read somewhere that only building regulations vary a lot by municipalities, by the way. So each city governs their building regulations or building codes, how buildings are done, who inspects them, who passes them to be livable and habited or for office space. And I read that only 7% of municipalities in Mexico actually have building regulations. Usually those municipalities start in Mexico City, and then based on what works in Mexico City, that usually gets adopted throughout the rest of the nation. So just FYI, that might be a reason why you move into a house, and maybe somewhere like Oaxaca or Huatulco, where there are earthquakes, or Puebla, where there tends to be earthquakes, you might move into a house that has had some previous, damage from a previous earthquake. Maybe it's not very apparent, but it might be some cracking in the walls, or it might be, some cracking on door frames, and it hasn't been fixed, and it hasn't been necessarily improved. Now, it doesn't mean that the building is going to fall. It doesn't mean that, it's unlivable or it's dangerous to live there. But there are certain things that don't get fixed right away. And it doesn't mean that, again, that they are unlivable. Usually when things like that happen, an earthquake, for example, there is a governmental authority that goes by and checks, the most affected areas, to check those buildings to ensure that they're safe for their people to go back into them. But that's just one example. Other examples might be, something simpler, like the way plumbing is done. And you might notice that, the way that you're used to plumbing being done in the United States or Canada, where most of you guys are watching from, is very different than the way that plumbing is done in Mexico. And you might notice that more if you're building your own home, or if you are buying a home on pre-sale. And then you go through the inspection process and you realize that, the way that your toilet is installed may be very different than it's installed north of the border. So all this to say that this is just some of the culture shocks that people have. And, that's a very simple one. It might not be a big deal breaker for a lot of you, but they might be something that you notice. Or, another thing kind of related to building regulations is broken things, or things that are in disrepair. So you might go into a store or a grocery store, or a tienda de abarrotes, which is kind of like a small convenience store. They have them everywhere. And you might notice that the walls are maybe, cracking, or, the paint isn't fully fixed. It might be chipped off, or it's just not perfectly manicured, and the Disneyland that a lot of, people from the US and Canada are used to, because the priority is set on things looking very good, very fixed, very modern, not in disrepair. And it's a cultural thing too. For a lot of people in the United States, if something is not working perfectly, then it might take priority for that homeowner or that landlord to fix it, and for it to be working perfectly. Whereas in Mexico, that might not be the priority. So that's just a cultural difference. Another thing that I think doesn't get talked about a lot, and personally, I don't mind it, but I know that a lot of people might be shocked by it, is we talk a lot on our on our city videos about why you should shop local, right? Going to these mercados or tianguis, which are these like open air markets that have usually, just a smaller selection of fruits and vegetables. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they have a very large selection, but they have, your selection of fruits, vegetables, meats, your fishes, your cheeses, and maybe some breads and spices and things like that. Well, you might notice that a lot of meats and fish might not have the same refrigeration that you're used to in, a big grocery store, for example. So, or maybe there's a lack of normal hygiene, or there might be just things like flies, flying around meat and fish, and it might be very, very unsettling for a lot of people. Um, but of course, you have to know which people to buy your local produce from. Now, if something doesn't look right, something doesn't smell right, then obviously don't buy it, right? Even if I share on a video that, this is one of the markets that's in town and it might have, a large selection of fruits, vegetables, or handcrafts and other household items. If their selection of meat is not good, don't buy their meat. Find the right carniceria or the right butcher shop in town, if you're living in that town, that does have the highest quality of meat. And these things are things that people are going to find out little by little, right? You're not going to be the expert on your local town or your local city right away. These are things that you're going to find out by talking to your friends, by talking to your neighbors, by maybe doing a relocation tour and asking your relocation tour guide, where does she or he buy their fish or their meat or their cheese or their bread or whatever it is that you're interested in. Another thing is imported foods may be harder to find. And if you do find them, they might cost 3 to 5 times more. So this might be frustrating for some people if you're really attached to a specific brand of whatever it is. Might be cheese, or might be milk, or it might be, bread or anything else. It might be an imported, sardine or something like that. And, Mexico has some excellent canned goods, excellent products, excellent food. But if you want to buy a specific imported product that doesn't get manufactured in Mexico, they obviously have to pay for import fees. And obviously transportation fees too. So you have to consider that, yes, it's going to be more expensive. I would encourage you to start trying out some of the local brands. Oftentimes, there's very little difference in the flavor, in the quality, in the packaging. Sometimes they might even be the same, but it might be the same manufacturer, but they just change the label because they have to be distributed by some company in Mexico. So, I would encourage you to start trying out some local foods and incorporating those into your grocery shopping list. That way, one, it'll save you money. Two, uh, you'll always find them. Like they will normally be stocked. And three, you will be getting more integrated or more accustomed to the way that locals cook and the way that the ingredients are used locally. So, yeah, imported foods may not be always easy to find, especially in more rural areas, right? Larger cities, not a big deal. I'm seeing some of the comments, by the way. So, thank you all so much for being here. Another thing that, I think maybe in our videos we talk about slightly, but we don't go into a lot of detail, are the lack of some basic services sometimes, and then in some places year round. So, for example, just to give you guys an idea, somebody who's living in the United States, isn't in Mexico, might not know that in some places, you're a really big heavy downpour or a really big rainfall or a really big storm may cause your power to go out. And that's just an infrastructure issue that happens even in the largest cities and even in the small rural towns, right? Like, it's not only in the small rural towns. It doesn't mean that the power is out all day long. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But if you're not used to that, then obviously that can be a shock for some people. I'll give you a perfect example of this. One of our customers was doing their residency process in Mazatlan last week, and there was some crazy rainfalls on the day that he needed to go do his canje. Well, the day he showed up, they had lost power at the immigration offices in Mazatlan. So he wasn't able to process his residency card that day. Now, luckily, he didn't mind too much. He could come back a day or two. It wasn't a big deal. But for somebody who might be just traveling to Mazatlan on that specific day, and then planning to leave the following day after having received the residency card, might have been very frustrated, right? Because they would have to change their flight or they would have to make arrangements for something else. So that is a perfect example of that. Now, other examples of that are there are specific neighborhoods in towns and cities where this happens a lot. So I do think that's why a relocation tour or a scouting trip is important. Even if you don't book through somebody that we recommend, I still recommend you reach out to a local that knows the area, that can take you around, that can show you which neighborhoods have issues, which neighborhoods have water problems, which neighborhoods have electricity problems, which neighborhoods have internet problems, if that's important to you. A local will know a lot of these things. And if that's important for you to know, I would kind of talk to that person before you hire them to ensure that they know those things and that your questions will be answered. So yeah, a scouting trip. I think is absolutely, uh, I think a must have. Obviously, I know some people move sight unseen, right? But I really do think that you should visit first and kind of get some of these things answered before just assuming that it's a perfect place, right, or a perfect city. Now, the goal of the channel when I started doing these videos was to show you that Mexico is just so much more than, just resort towns or some of the popular places like San Miguel de Allende. And I get a lot of feedback that a lot of people say, wow, you just put out a video on whatever city, Cuernavaca or Puebla or Atlisco, and now I want to go there because they had no idea that those areas existed or that they were, that beautiful or that they had really good weather or whatever the case might be that we showed on the video that resonated with that person. But again, it doesn't mean that that place or that city is perfect. Another reason that I think some people might, or another common complaint, right, I should say, that people have is corruption. And that happens at the police level, it happens at the government level, it happens sometimes in real estate, it happens in a lot of different transactions. I'm not saying it happens all the time, but it does happen in all these facets of Mexican life. The biggest one being police corruption. And I think that really puts off a lot of people. Obviously, I think it's very natural and very reasonable for you to be put off by it. My biggest advice, obviously, is always going to be if you get asked for a bribe from a cop or a federal, I would say don't pay it. But there are legitimate times when I think it can be very you can be in a vulnerable position, especially if you don't speak Espanol, right? You only speak English. It's very hard for you to communicate. This is your first time driving on a highway in Mexico by yourself. Or maybe, that person or that cop is being very intimidating with you. And I totally get it. It can be very intimidating. Sometimes it might just not be worth it to try to, get them to give you the ticket and you follow them to the station. So my advice is always going to be, try your hardest to not pay the bribe. Let them know that they're supposed to give you a ticket, that you will follow them to the station. In our guide, we have a letter in Spanish that says, please, I know what my rights are. I know that, this is not how we're supposed to settle a ticket, basically. I would like to follow you to the station, something to that effect. And, but if you're not a customer and you don't have access to that letter, you should know that what your rights are. And if a cop is asking you to pay a speeding ticket right then and there in cash, that's not common. That's a bribe. So, you should ask for a ticket. And if they don't want to give you a ticket, then ask that you can go follow them to the station and pay it at the station for whatever it is that you're doing wrong. Try not to do anything wrong. Try not to speed. Try to follow the road rules. Try to obviously drive safely and do all the things that you're supposed to. But even in the best scenario where you're following all the rules, they might still stop you. And then it's your word against theirs. So corruption is the thing that puts people off, and I totally get it. Again, it doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. So that might be a deal breaker for somebody, and I understand why. Another is the lack of variety of household items like cookware, bedding, decorations, or electronics, especially kitchen appliances, right? And this is actually one of those things that when I ask our customers, after they've been settled in for some time, and I'm going to start integrating this more into our videos because I think a lot of you are probably very interested in this as much as I am. What is it that you wish you would have brought, and what did you bring that probably wasn't necessary for you to bring? And I get almost always the same answers, and that's usually like, oh, I wish I would have brought my super jumbo towels, right? And that's something that's very it's not easy for you to find at every department store. Or I wish I would have brought my very specific bedding, especially if they moved into a rental where where the rental was furnished, and the furnishings, or specifically the beds in that apartment or that house, are the mattress size in Mexico, because mattress sizes in Mexico are different than mattress sizes in north of the border, United States, Canada. So a queen size in Mexico is a little bit smaller than a queen size in the United States. So your bed sheets might not fit perfectly. And that's something that people say, man, I really wish I would have brought some of those things. But yeah, like kitchen appliances, like air fryers, ninjas, ninja Instapot, I'm sorry. Especially the really, really large ones. It's not that you can't find them in Mexico. Obviously, you can find those things in Mexico, but they might not be the large jumbo size that some people are used to, or they might cost 2 or 3 times more, especially if you're buying them at a department store where they have, more, where they have a markup on these things because they're more of a luxury department store. They might have like an off-brand version of this kitchen appliance, and it might not be exactly in the Instapot brand, but it serves kind of the same functions. So yes, you can find a lot of these things, but you might not find the 30 different varieties of the same kitchen appliance than you would like somewhere in the United States or Canada. And, I guess if you live in Europe and you're watching us from Europe, this is probably less of an issue for you, because I know these are some of the same common things in Europe. You don't have, 25, 30 different varieties of Instant Pots when you go into a department store, or like a Walmart or like a Bed Bath & Beyond, or if those even exist. Another thing is the way things work at government offices. So that's very different. And a lot of people get very frustrated by that. And especially if that's their first interaction or their first introduction into how Mexican bureaucracy works, it can be very, very frustrating, because government offices don't do a really good job of having an updated website or updates for their constituents, or updates in general. Like, they post information once and then, it might not be updated for years. Sometimes they're really good on specific things, sometimes not at all. And then if you don't know how to read legal Spanish, even if you Google Translate it, it doesn't translate it one for one perfectly. So you have to learn how to navigate that on your own. Now, if you hire, obviously, a facilitator, or in Spanish we call them gestores, who know these specific things, specifically, immigration, real estate, those kinds of things where, they know the law and they know how to read or interpret legal Spanish, then it's obviously easier. But there is some beauty in being able to figure things out for yourself, right? And learn how to do things for yourself. At the beginning, you might hire more facilitators, but then, your first year in, your second year in, you might do more things on your own. You might, figure out how to register your car correctly or how to pay the tenencia, how to do your predial or your property taxes, or how to pay your HOA fees. And all those things that at the beginning seemed a little daunting, as you start acclimating and getting settled, they will become easier. So, but at the beginning, the way that things work is very different. Uh, you can't find pretty much every answer that you want just by Googling it. It doesn't work like that. Mexico isn't the way that the United States and Canada is in that regard, that, all government websites give you detailed, specific steps on what to bring and what to expect and where to make an appointment and all these things that are very easy for people to do on their own. In fact, in Mexico, it's very common, even for local Mexicans, to hire a gestor for many different things. So it's not only foreigners that are hiring facilitators. A lot of local Mexicans hire facilitators for many of these things too. In fact, we have a lot of customers that speak perfect Spanish, and they even hire some of our facilitators that we recommend to help them with a lot of things, because, again, they might not be able to find this information on their own just by simply visiting a government website. And they want to have a faster way. That they're paying for convenience. They're paying to learn how to do it that very first time by somebody who does it day in and day out, so that next time they can take it on their own. Yeah, there's unfortunately a lot of misinformation on social media. Um, I agree, and there's nothing you can do about it. The best thing you can do about it is do your due diligence, right? I don't think that even our customers at Mexico Relocation Guide, even people who buy the guide, I know that we're not the only source that they're getting their information from. I try to encourage them for the guide to be their initial source, or at least like the source of truth. But I know that they take the information that they read on the guide and then they decide to research it a little bit further. And I think that's absolutely smart. In fact, I know that the relocation guide isn't going to be the end all be all to your research process, right? Like, if you start reading a piece on our online guide about buying real estate, and then we list the documents that you're going to need, well, you're probably going to research what those documents are and how to find them and when you need them. And we have a lot of that information in the online guide. But then you're going to be researching other things like, you know, where you should buy and what the process is for buying on somewhere like a beach versus somewhere inland and all those things. So I don't think that our online guide is going to be the end all be all to your research. I do think it saves you a lot of time. I think it saves you hundreds of hours. I know it does. And our contacts just also save you a lot of time, because if you hire one of them, they help you through the process and they do a lot of the hand holding for you. Um, but there's going to be things very specific to your situation that you're still going to have to research on your own. And I know that there's a lot of websites out there that unfortunately have some bad information. There's also some that have really, really good information. So I can't say that all of them have misleading information. But yeah, I would say where you find the most misleading information are probably Facebook groups, especially from people who have the best of intentions. They comment on a question that was asked about, whatever it might be. Let's just say residency, for example. And they say, well, when I did it, it was like this, and this is how much it cost me, and these are the steps I followed. But it turns out that, when they applied for residency, might have been 4 years ago, 5 years ago. And that process is entirely different 5 years later. So they might not have, misinformation in their minds, but they are spreading misinformation. So just be careful where you get your information from. There's also a lot of like new up and coming experts that share just plain wrong information. For example, I get an email now about once a day, or not once a day, like once a week, asking me about, this special provision in the residence in the immigration law that allows people who are pensioned or have Social Security benefits to basically bypass any economic solvency requirements, and that they can just become permanent residents. And if you read the law, that's not what it says. The law states something else very clearly, but, some new expert decided to just interpret it the way that they want to interpret it. And a lot of people are listening to it thinking it's fact, and they might be wrongly advised. And then what ends up happening is they actually go to a consulate, they bring up this information that they got somewhere off of YouTube, and the consulate tells them no, and then they fight with consulate employees. And then, if you're the next person who's applying for residency right after that person, you might get that consulate employee, frustrated that all foreigners are like this. But in fact, they're not, right? A lot of them are very well educated, very well informed. But yeah, just be careful what you read. Not everything is 100% accurate. Definitely the information you find on our website and the information you find on our guide, I can guarantee you that it is accurate because, one, I'm not writing it by myself. We have it fact-checked by the professionals that we work with. So the minute that I have new information from one of them, whether it's a real estate attorney that we recommend, or an immigration facilitator that we recommend, or a realtor, or a healthcare broker, or a private relocation tour guide, anytime I have new information from them who are actually doing this day in and day out, and that they have verified that it's true, then I update it in the guide. So the people who buy the guide get that information updated consistently. The cultural difference that I think some people might have a hard time getting used to, and I find it kind of interesting, because to me this is very normal, but I know for a lot of people who, you see, I grew up on both sides. I grew up partly in the United States and then partly in Mexico, because my whole family lives in Mexico. But when I was very little, we moved to the United States. We moved to Texas. And, even though in my household, we were very much a Mexican family, followed all Mexican traditions. And then I spent, every summer in Mexico City, and then visited Mexico City regularly throughout my adult life, uh, every year. So I grew up in both sides of the culture, right? So to me, this is very normal. But for somebody who never grew up with Mexican culture, this might be something to get used to. And that's that Mexicans are very, very friendly. So we like to say yes to everything. And in fact, it's not that we like to say yes to everything. It's just that it's hard for us to say no, because we like to be polite, and to us saying no, like straight no, seems impolite or rude, right? So we're not very confrontational. And sometimes that can come off as like, oh, okay, so they agreed to do this. And, you might hire, for example, a plumber, and they told you, oh, yeah, I can get this done. I can fix this for you, and I can come tomorrow, 10 a.m., no problem. And then they don't show up. And the problem might be that, he really does have the best intentions of coming and fixing. He might not, right? He might actually just like, he never intended on coming the following day. And I'm not making excuses for people who don't show up. But the fact is that a lot of the times, people just don't know how to say no. And they might come a week later, and you might be, hunting them down and asking them like, hey, you told me you were coming tomorrow. What's going on? Or, you told me you might, have this piece by the following day, and then they don't. And that just happens a lot. And I know that's very, very frustrating, especially when in the United States or Canada, or, even in Europe, when you say yes to something, that means yes. And it's not very hard for people in Canada or the United States or Europe to say no, right? When they can't, or they don't have the availability or the part or whatever situation it might be. So yeah, that's something that you might have to get used to. Or even in friendships, right? Like if somebody might have a hard time saying no, even though they can't. Speaking of cultural differences, I think another thing that if I can help you start getting integrated any better, it's by really start every conversation, every interaction by saying, you know, a hello, a greeting, like hello, good morning, hello, good afternoon, or hello, buenos dias, buenas tardes, buenas noches. And then saying, you know, ¿cómo está? Or how are you? Or ¿cómo le va? How's it going, right? Every interaction, you know, especially if you know the person to some extent, if they're a total stranger, then, you know, just waving and saying, you know, acknowledging their presence is totally fine. But if you know somebody and you've had a conversation with them before, it's strange for us Mexicans to just get straight to the point on what we're talking about. I mean, cordialities are very, very common, so it's very normal for us to get into, you know, how's your family, or how's business, or how's something relevant about them that you know that maybe the last time you guys talked about, you know, how's your mom, something like that. It's very common for us to get into that small talk before we get straight into business, especially if it's business related. If it's, you know, if it's a friendly conversation, you'd probably start with those, you know, with that common chit chat or common small talk at the beginning anyway. But if you're talking about business and you're, you know, even if it's your house cleaning lady, or even if it's you know, your gardener, or I would say especially if it's somebody that comes to your house very, very regularly, I would start with those things before just getting straight to the point, like, hey, you know, I would like these things trimmed today, or, you know, can you pay some attention to these plants, or can you pay attention to this cabinet that needs some dusting? You know, just start like, hey, how's your day, how are you doing, blah blah blah. And then, you know, ask for whatever it is that you're going to ask. um, Traffic. I don't think that a lot of people realize that there is a lot of traffic in major cities, a lot of traffic, and the way people drive is very different. If you're interested, by the way, in, you know, some driving tips, some general driving tips, I did write an article about that I'm going to share in the comments. So if you're interested in that, I have it in the comments section. But yeah, the way people drive is very different. And, you know, there are traffic signs and traffic rules. And sometimes they are suggestions. For example, stop signs. Stop signs, or altos, are not always followed, especially, you know, on um, streets that have a lot of businesses or a lot of commerce around them, where, you know, there's like a steady flow of stop and go, stop and go, stop and go. You know, if nobody's coming and somebody knows that nobody's coming in the direction that they need to stop for, they might just run through a stop sign. And for you, that might not be normal. And you might want to follow the rules to a T. So you might stop at the stop sign, but the person behind you might not realize that you're going to make a full stop, and they might run into you. So that's something that's very common, that some people have fender benders like that. But traffic is something to get used to for sure, especially in major cities. Guadalajara, bad traffic all the time. Mexico City, bad traffic all the time. Querétaro, same thing. So any city that's growing, any city that has, you know, an influx of people all of a sudden moving into it, are going to have traffic issues, especially on the weekends when people do a lot of traveling in between cities. So expect a lot of traffic. And people drive a lot, right? Like a lot of people obviously do take public transportation, but there's a lot of cars in every household. Or I shouldn't say there's a lot of cars in every household, but there are a lot of households that have cars. So, you know, driving is very common, and there are a lot of cars on the road. So traffic is something that you need to consider, especially if you're driving in between one city to the next and you have a specific time you need to get there. I would add maybe another hour or two, especially if it's the weekend. So traffic is a nuisance for sure, anywhere. Doesn't matter where you live. Oh, this is a big one. If you're sensitive to noise, and what I mean by if you're sensitive to noise, I don't mean like, uh, just like, a loud party, or although those do happen too, but I'm talking like, everyday noise that you can't just, blur out. Mexico might not be for you. There are, I don't care where you live, unless you live in the middle of nowhere where there's very little people living around you. It doesn't matter where you live, you're probably going to be exposed to barking dogs all night, right? Like the culture of leaving dogs to bark outside is very common, and something that might not be very common in the US or Canada, very common in Mexico, barking dogs. Or if you're in a rural area and you have, farm animals around you, like roosters, very common. But then on top of that, fireworks. Fireworks are just very, very loud, and they set them off all the time, especially in pueblos mágicos or in rural areas. I would say it's probably less common in big cities, certainly in like Guadalajara, Mexico City, Querétaro. You'll just get, the common like neighbor throwing a really loud party until, 4, 5 a.m. But fireworks aren't as common. However, in smaller towns, they always have like, the celebration of some saint, or there is a celebration of, something in the church, or it might be somebody's quinceañera, might be somebody's wedding, and fireworks are set off. And it might be Wednesday, it might be a Tuesday, it doesn't always happen on the weekends. And it might not be you that's sensitive to these noises, it might be your pets. So just something for you to consider. Another reason why I think a scouting trip is good. That way you can be there, Monday through Sunday, and kind of see what the noise is like, at least for that week. Obviously, I'd recommend spending a little more than just a week in a place before deciding if that's the place for you or if that's a city for you. But if that's very least you can do, then it gives you a good idea of whether your pets can endure the fireworks. I'm thinking specifically of San Miguel de Allende and Ajijic when I mention these things, because that's one of the things that people have complained about the most. Not only to me directly, but also I see it on Facebook groups, or when we did a group tour in 2021, that was one of the things that people were just like, oh, there's a lot of fireworks. And it wasn't a weekend, it was just like a normal Thursday. There was the celebration of a saint, and they were setting off fireworks at 2 in the morning or something like that. So anyway, fireworks are just a nuisance for a lot of people. So if you're very sensitive to that, definitely consider where you're going to live first. Late parties and loud music are also a cultural thing. And it might not even be, it might be a church that's throwing a loud party. Like it might not be a residence, it might not be somebody in their home. It might actually be, a church, which how are you going to go and confront a church to bring down their noise levels, right? Like it's, I personally wouldn't. And I personally wouldn't confront a neighbor either, unless, you have some form of relationship with them at least before, which is more the reason why I think you should get to know your neighbors and learn Spanish, or at least the basics, as soon as possible. That way you can form a relationship with your neighbor and have some level of rapport, have some level of relationship before just the very first introduction to yourself being, hey, can you turn your music down? Something that's very disturbing, right? And something that puts off a lot of people, other than like crime and corruption, is the treatment of pets, specifically dogs. And although I do think this is changing culturally, slowly but surely it's changing. It's very off-putting. It's very disturbing. You might see a lot of, I mentioned dogs being left outside to bark, but you might also see dogs left on rooftops when it's really hot outside, or when it's pouring rain, or when it's thundering, and they have no way to get off that rooftop. So the treatment of animals is culturally different. It doesn't happen everywhere. It doesn't happen in every household. I do think this is changing a lot culturally, but historically, dogs were meant to be just the protector of the house. And I think it's not until like recently in the last, 30, 40 years that dogs have slowly become part of the family too. But you might see that still, and you see it a lot actually, that dogs are left unattended, like on a rooftop, or maybe, behind a garage, or in a garage, or and you see they might not have water, or they might not have easy access to water, um, and they might just look neglected, and many times they are. So the treatment of animals can be very different, and it can be disturbing. All right, so some of the reasons that people leave. And I mentioned all these things that, some of the negatives and some of the complaints that I hear about the most. Not because I want to discourage you from moving to Mexico, or because I want to tell you like, oh, this is everything that's wrong. In fact, if this is your very first time watching a live stream from Mexico Relocation Guide, that's not the tone of this channel at all. I talk a lot about, how to move to Mexico the right way. Uh, but I don't want to like tell you like, oh, everything's wrong. It's not. Obviously, for anybody who has been following us for a while, you know that I will always say the pros outweigh the cons. There's a lot of positives of moving to Mexico, right? The people, the amazingness of the people, the warmness of the people. That's the number one thing that you will hear across the board from anybody who has moved from abroad to Mexico. It's the people, right? Just how incredibly friendly and inviting and warm and welcoming we are to foreigners. Obviously the weather, depending on where you move, but the weather is a big reason why people move to Mexico. If you're living in the highlands, you can have pretty good temperate weather throughout the year. If you live in somewhere very cold and you really, really want that warm weather, well, you can live on a coastal town that has, pretty good, warm, sunny, bright days almost every single day of the year. So a lot of people move because of weather. And obviously there's other things like cost of living. The food is amazing. Culturally, we are very, very rich. We have, a ton of history. There's so much history in Mexico, and it just has made this country of beautiful traditions, beautiful folklore, beautiful music, beautiful food, beautiful color. So, it has a lot of really, really beautiful things. But these are some of the reasons that people leave. Now, I did mention cost of living being a reason that people love living in Mexico, but obviously cost of living is also a reason that people leave. And especially recently when, the peso traditionally was exchanging at about 20 US dollars. I mean, $1 to 20 pesos. Historically, that had been the exchange rate for about 2-3 years. And a lot of people, were moving to Mexico, and, their $1,500 you could live very, very comfortably on that. And people were renting at the very top end of their budget because, they could afford it. And rentals were definitely affordable. And, there was a lot of pros to the exchange rate that was a year ago. Well, recently the peso gained a lot of strength, and the peso went to, sometimes 16, even at one point it was 15.8 to $1. So, if your rental at one point was $600, it might have been $700 now. And that extra $100 could be very devastating for somebody who's on a very tight budget. At some point, it might have been a $700 rental was now $900 because of the exchange rate. So the cost of living fluctuation definitely put off some people, and I know a lot of people left when that happened recently. Now, the peso is gaining strength, and then sometimes it loses strength and it goes back to, in favor of a lot of foreigners. But there are fluctuations, and I think anytime that you're moving to a country with a different currency, that's something that you have to consider in your budget. You should definitely consider renting on the lower end of your budget, so that if there is a sudden drop in your currency, or if there's a sudden gain on the opposing currency, you're not left with the budget, the debt, right? And you're not having to like figure out other areas in your life that you need to cut out, or maybe even suffer through, so that you can afford your rent or basic things like food. So cost of living is actually a reason that people leave. Another reason is obviously they might have heard that living on $1,000 is absolutely possible. And while that might be true in a very rural town, or that might be true in even some cities, there are people obviously who are living on $1,000. They're living a very basic life. They might not have things like, access to regular medical attention, or they might not be eating out very often. They might be doing all of their cooking at home. So they might not have any money for entertainment. They might not, or very, very little money left for entertainment. They might not have money to have a car. They might not have money to travel. They might not have money to just, do anything other than sit around at home watching TV and keeping a very simple life, right? And using public transportation, things like that. And then obviously making all your meals at home and having a very inexpensive rental. So, some people move with the idea that, their $1,000 is going to afford them this wonderful life with house cleaning 3 times a week and, basically a live-in chef, and that's just not the case. Mexico's not cheap. I want to reiterate that, like, just because I might put out a blog post about, hey, you can find some rentals for, 10,000 pesos, 12,000 pesos, doesn't mean that they're going to be the fanciest or the most luxurious rentals. I'm just trying to show you that you can actually do it on a lower budget. But there are definitely, for the 12,000 peso rental, there's definitely a rental in the same neighborhood that's going to be 30,000, 40,000 pesos or more. So just, keep that in mind. Mexico's not cheap. You can very easily spend a lot of money in Mexico if you want to live a luxurious life. And for some people, that's absolutely what they want. If they were spending $5,000 a month before just to live a very basic life wherever they were living, that might afford them, the cleaner 3 times a week, the chef that might come once a week, things like that. They might have never been able to afford back home. So cost of living is definitely one of the reasons that some people might leave, particularly relating to fluctuations in exchange rates when somebody comes with a tight budget or a very fixed income. Medical is actually, I think, probably more of a reason that people leave historically than cost of living. And I think it's because a lot of people don't budget for medical. So they have they might have, they might fall, hurt their knee, hurt their hip, hurt their leg, hurt their arm, whatever the case might be, and might need surgery or a specialist. And those things cost a lot of money when you don't have insurance. And even though it might still be significantly less than what you would pay out of pocket in a hospital in the United States or somewhere else in the world, doesn't mean that it's cheap by any means, right? It might still be thousands of dollars. So, and if you don't have that in savings, if you don't have that set aside, the hospital is going to want some form of deposit to ensure that you're going to continue paying this bill. If you don't have that deposit, they won't give you medical attention. You won't be able to see that specialist. So you might have to go to somewhere like a government-run hospital. And then you might have to wait until a specialist is available, if you even have access to that government-run hospital. So there's a lot of things that people don't maybe plan for. where they should have planned for these things. And when they do happen to them, they end up leaving because they don't have the funds or they don't have the resources to cover these things. So if you can take anything away from today's live stream, I hope that, medical is something that you plan for. It's not something that you think, well, it'll never happen to me, so therefore I'll just plan for it when it does. I hope that you do plan for it in advance, because hopefully it never happens to you. Hopefully it never happens to any of us. But if it does, wouldn't you rather be prepared for it than, have the hardship of having to deal with that on top of whatever you're dealing with physically? So, yeah, hopefully you just set at least some money aside to plan for any medical emergencies. And then if you're from the United States, a lot of people if you're from the United States and you're eligible for Medicare, a lot of people keep Medicare as a plan B. So if it's something that's not life-threatening, they use their Medicare back home. So they might fly back home and get treated. If it is a life-threatening emergency, depending on what it is, especially, you might be able to use Medicare Advantage in Mexico if you're from the United States and you have access to Medicare. I also have a video about that if you're interested in learning more. There's very specific reasons where you can use it, and not all Medicare Advantage plans are eligible for this kind of coverage outside of the United States. So very important for you to know that. Weather is actually another reason that people move. And they might not leave Mexico entirely, but they might leave the city that they originally thought they were going to love. This particularly happened actually in Lake Chapala this year, where I think, Lake Chapala has historically been known as having some of the best weather in the world. I think it's been coined as actually the best weather in the world. But this year, Lake Chapala had, some very, very, very warm weather. Air conditioning is not very common there. The rainy season started late. There was a lot of different things that happened that a lot of people just couldn't stand it. And then on top of that, if you lived in one of the neighborhoods that had water issues, that might just be the straw that broke the camel's back. So you might end up moving somewhere else with nicer weather or more temperate weather year round. So weather is actually another reason that some people might end up moving. So another reason why I think that you should do a scouting trip, and you should try to do a scouting trip at the hottest time of the year in any place. Whether you're moving to La Paz or whether you're moving to Puebla or you're moving to Huatulco or Merida, I think you should do a scouting trip at the hottest time of the year. Because if you can withstand that temperature at that hottest time of the year, then the rest of the year you'll be okay. But if you can like it at its worst, then you will love it at its best. So I think that's my piece of advice regarding weather. You won't know the weather until you live there the full year, and then every year, obviously, it changes, at least a little bit. But, try to visit at the hottest time of the year. Another reason people leave is isolation. They miss family too much, and maybe they don't know enough Espanol to get to know people nearby or make community, make friends, get to know their neighbors. And they might not have any interest in learning the language. So it's very isolating, especially if you move to Mexico by yourself and you don't have a partner or a roommate or anybody that you live with. It can be very isolating. So a lot of people end up moving back home because of that. They had the best intention to learn Spanish, but then it became really hard for them, and they just didn't continue learning it, and they're just really isolated. So if that's you, that might be something you need to consider. If you know that you have no intention of learning Spanish, I would say, Mexico's not for you. Yes, there's a lot of places that speak English, and there's a lot of people that speak English, but the official language is Spanish, Español. And a lot of doors will open for you when you learn it. A lot of new relationships will come into your life when you learn it, beautiful relationships. And you'll experience a culture very differently when you learn the language and when you're able to understand what people are saying around you, at least a little bit, right? But if you're totally in the dark the whole time, it can get very exhausting. Aging parents is another reason that people leave. So if you have parents at home that might be older, it's something that a lot of people write to us, and they tell us, like, I'm waiting for my mom to pass, or I'm waiting for my dad to pass because I'm their caregiver, or just because I want to be around if they ever do. So that might be something to consider. You might want to bring them with you. Another thing that I think is amazing that a lot of people don't know is how affordable caregiving is in Mexico compared to the United States or Canada. And I mean, like, even if they're not going to be living with you and they're going to be living in an assisted living facility, assisted living facilities in Mexico are extremely, extremely affordable compared to somewhere in the United States or Canada. Obviously, it depends on the facility. But just from the research that I have done and comparing it to some assisted living facilities in the United States, I mean, we're talking about like an assisted living facility that might have, 3 meals a day with some nurses that come on, a doctor that comes on site maybe 2-3 times a week. And then, some nurses that work full time might cost $1,200, whereas in the US, you're looking at $5,000, $6,000 or more, depending on the kind of care that the patient needs. Now, obviously, there are some things that you need to consider, like, does the staff speak English? Specifically what your parent or family member might have, and what level of care they need. So at that case, you might want to have a live-in person instead of having them in an assisted living facility. But yeah, aging parents overall are just another reason that people end up leaving once they've actually moved to Mexico. Wanderlust. So I know that a lot of us, like, if we're, moving from one country to the next, it's probably because we have some level of wanderlust. We like to explore. We like to experience other cultures. We like to learn other languages. We like to, taste other foods and, be involved in other traditions. So eventually, you might have explored a lot of Mexico and then you get bored, and some people leave. Not trying to say that Mexico's boring by any means, but I know that some people end up getting wanderlust and they just, maybe they want to go to Portugal next, or they want to go to Costa Rica or Panama. And then obviously, another reason that some people might leave is crime. And even though, again, I know that a lot of foreigners say, like, oh, I feel safer in Mexico than I did ever in wherever they are from, the United States usually, because there's a lot of mass shootings, or because there's, shootings in a lot of places, doesn't mean that Mexico is 100% safe. There are certainly areas that I wouldn't live in. There are certainly cities that I don't endorse, and you'll never see me put out a video on a city that I wouldn't live in, or that I don't think is a good place for you to live in. But that doesn't mean that the entire country is, unsafe, or that the entire country is one place or one city or one town that gets, you see on the news, like, oh, 5 people were shot in Mexico, and they don't specify the name of the city, or they don't specify the name of the town. And then people get really scared of that. But if somebody experiences crime themselves, then, that's never okay. And obviously that can be very scary, and that can be very off-putting. So they might end up leaving because of that. So I want you to see that, like, there's not a single place in the world that's 100% safe. There's not a single country that's crime-free. Mexico certainly isn't it. There's definitely crime, whether it's, petty crime, or robberies, or theft, or, cartel-related crime. There's definitely crime in Mexico. Doesn't mean that you need to be scared of moving here. But I would say you do need to do your due diligence on what are the areas and what are the spots that you need to avoid for you to, avoid being in the way of some of these organized crime groups. Now, in the form of robberies, theft, petty crime, those kinds of things, well, that happens anywhere. It doesn't matter if it's Ajijic, it doesn't matter if it's Puerto Vallarta or, Huatulco or Merida, even Merida, that's coined to be, the safest city in Mexico. There's still crime in Merida, guys. Like, it doesn't mean that you need to just like not worry and not, not watch your surroundings or not be, aware of what's going on around you. Of course, there's still crime in Merida. It just means that there's less crime there than other cities in Mexico. So that's my whole list on what are some of the negatives of living in Mexico, why it's not for everybody, and then why some people leave. I see second safest. Yeah, I know it goes between like safest, second safest. Some people who live in Merida will obviously say it's the safest city in all of Mexico, and then some people will say it's second safest. I see so many comments and so many questions, and I'm sorry. I know that you guys always have questions on these live streams. This wasn't meant to be a Q&A. I just wanted to share some of the things that I wanted to address some of the comments that we've gotten on videos, because I don't want you to think that we never want to talk about the negatives. Mexico's not perfect by any means. Many cities in Mexico are incredibly modern. They have all the modern facilities, modern amenities, beautiful malls, beautiful skyscrapers, beautiful neighborhoods, beautiful houses. But that doesn't mean that, they're perfect by any means. And the goal, again, of the channel was to give you guys information on how to move to Mexico the right way. The goal of the city tour videos was to show you that there's more to Mexico than just some of the touristic towns, so that you can see that you can move to these other cities that, one, might be more affordable, have less expats living in them, so that you'll be more forced to learn Spanish. And, some people just don't want to live around other expats. That there are other areas that have really nice weather, that they're not that big, that they have small towns too, that they're just as beautiful as some of the touristic towns that a lot of foreigners move to. So the goal of those city tours is to give you guys an overview of what it's like to live in those towns. But I will say that the point is not to say like Mexico's perfect. So I hope you guys have found this to be useful today. If you are interested in, I know that I may have mentioned kind of in between some of the comments or some of the topics that I talked about our relocation guide. If you're interested in that, visit our website, mexicorelocationguide.com. And I've put some links in the comments on some articles that I think are relevant to what we're talking about today, particularly one that I wrote called The 13 Negatives of Living in Mexico. And then another one is, pro tips for driving in Mexico. So some tips that will help you hopefully avoid some surprises. So thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys very, very soon. We have a video coming soon this weekend, and then we have some more videos coming very soon. We have videos on Valladolid, on Mérida, on Playa del Carmen. We have videos on Chiapas, and so much more coming down the line. And I know some of you guys in Baja California and Baja California Sur have asked us, or maybe people considering moving to one of those two states have told us, please do a video on La Paz or Rosarito, Ensenada, or some other areas. And I guarantee you we're working as hard as we can to bring you guys all of Mexico. But, we're doing our very, very best. So trust me, we have heard you. I have heard you. I'm taking your feedback very seriously. And again, if you want to be a guest on a future show and share your experience on moving to Mexico or living in Mexico, and if you want to help somebody else, with their questions, just by doing a live stream like this where you get to answer some questions from the audience, send me an email, info@mexicorelocationguide.com. So thank you guys so much for being here. I'll see you guys very soon. Hasta luego.